Before any explanation was offered, before social media posts or late interviews tried to fill the gaps, there was a long and uneasy silence surrounding Danielle Colby, Frank Fritz, and Mike Wolfe. It was the kind of silence that unsettled fans rather than comforted them, because something familiar had vanished without warning. The white van that once rolled down endless back roads, packed with laughter, arguments, and excitement over forgotten relics, suddenly felt incomplete. No announcement, no emotional goodbye, just an absence that lingered episode after episode. Viewers sensed it immediately. Something had broken behind the scenes, and no one was saying what it was. Frank Fritz did not exit American Pickers with a dramatic farewell. He simply faded out. One week he was there, joking and digging through dust, and then he wasn't. The show went on, cameras still rolling, discoveries still made, but the rhythm fell off. Fans noticed the missing energy, the missing voice, the quiet space where Frank used to stand. Questions began to pile up. Was there a fight? Was it money? Had fame finally destroyed a friendship that once looked unshakable? And at the center of all those questions stood Danielle Colby, watching as speculation grew louder by the day. Danielle was never the one driving the van or crawling to Barnes, but she was always there. She was the constant, the one answering calls, tracking leads, holding the operation together while the others were on the road. From the earliest days of the show, she saw everything unfold up close. That is why her silence mattered. It was not the silence of someone uninvolved. It was the silence of someone who knew too much to speak carelessly. As rumors spread online, people began to demand answers from her, pushing her to pick a side, to confirm their theories, to turn a complicated reality into a simple headline. Behind the polished episodes, the pressure had been building for years. What started as a rough idea filmed with shaky cameras slowly transformed into a massive television machine. Longer shoots, tighter schedules, higher expectations. The joy of discovery began to compete with exhaustion. Frank, once known for his quiet focus and love of the smallest details, seemed increasingly worn down. Calls grew shorter, his presence less consistent. Danielle could hear it in his voice, even when he brushed off concern with a tired joke. There was something heavier beneath the surface, something no edit could fully hide. Mike, on the other hand, leaned into the momentum. New shops, bigger plans, more responsibility. He carried the weight of keeping the show alive, pushing forward even when the pace became relentless. Danielle stood between them, as she always had, trying not to interfere, trying to keep everything steady. She saw how differently fame touched each of them. One thrived on it. The other struggled to keep up, physically and emotionally. The balance that once made the show special began to slip. When Frank finally stopped appearing, the silence turned into noise. Fans flooded comment sections and message boards with theories. Some blamed Mike, accusing him of pushing Frank aside. Others believed Frank had walked away in anger. Danielle absorbed it all, saying nothing. Not because she did not care, but because the truth was not a clean story of villains and victims. It was messy. It involved pain, health, disappointment, and the slow realization that things could not continue as they once had. For a long time, Danielle chose to protect that truth by keeping it to herself. Every day she opened the shop, greeted fans, smiled through the questions. Where is Frank? Is he coming back? She gave careful answers, vague enough to avoid lies, quiet enough to avoid feeding rumors. But silence has a cost. Eventually, it becomes a story of its own, and people begin to write it for you. The moment Danielle finally broke that silence was not explosive. It was not fueled by anger or revenge. It came from exhaustion and the need to stop the distortion. Her words did not confirm a dramatic feud. They confirmed something far more uncomfortable. That what happened was not about betrayal, but about watching someone you care about slowly lose the ability to keep going. It was about helplessness, about standing on the sidelines while a body gave out long before the spirit was ready. That first crack in the silence changed everything. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about a missing cast member. It became about the cost of years on the road, the weight of expectation, and the quiet tragedies that reality television rarely shows. Danielle did not offer closure in that moment. She offered context, and from there, the real story began to emerge, one that would force fans to look beyond rumors and face the reality that sometimes there is no fight, only loss unfolding in slow motion. Long before the cameras, before the polished episodes and the fame that followed, the world Danielle Colby stepped into was small, practical, and built on trust. Back then, American Pickers was not a brand or a phenomenon. It was an idea held together by enthusiasm, stubborn belief, and a handful of people willing to gamble their time on something uncertain. Danielle entered that world not as a performer, but as someone who understood the grind behind the dream. She was comfortable in the background, answering phones, chasing leads, keeping things organized while others chased stories on the road. Her early connection to Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz was rooted in that shared struggle. There were no crowds waiting outside the shop, no social media metrics, no pressure to deliver dramatic moments on demand. Just long days, unpredictable schedules, and the hope that digging through forgotten places might someday turn into something bigger. Danielle saw Mike's drive early on. He talked endlessly about saving history, about giving value to things people had written off. His energy filled rooms, sometimes pushing others to move faster than they wanted to. Frank balanced that energy in his own way. He was quieter, more methodical, drawn to the mechanics of objects rather than the spectacle of the find. Those differences were not a problem at first. They were the reason the dynamic worked. Mike dreamed big. Frank focused small. Danielle stood between them, translating ideas into action, smoothing rough edges, making sure the shop stayed ready for whatever rolled in next. She learned their rhythms, their habits, the subtle shifts in tone that told her when one of them was frustrated or exhausted. It felt less like a workplace and more like a family built on shared obsession. When the show finally took off, the shift was immediate and overwhelming. Overnight, the shop transformed from a quiet base into a pilgrimage site. Fans poured in, cameras captured every movement, and the pace of life accelerated. Danielle adapted quickly on the surface. She smiled for photos, answered endless questions, embraced the attention with her distinctive style and confidence. But behind that ease was constant pressure. The phone rang nonstop. Leads flooded in. Expectations rose. What once felt organic now had deadlines attached. Mike thrived in that environment. The success validated years of persistence. New opportunities opened, new projects demanded attention, and the scale of the operation grew. Frank experienced it differently. The same spotlight that energized Mike weighed on him. Long days on the road, physical labor, and constant filming took a toll that was not immediately visible on screen. Danielle noticed small changes first. Shorter conversations, less enthusiasm when discussing upcoming shoots, moments of silence that lingered longer than before. Still, they pushed forward. The show demanded it. Production schedules tightened. Episodes became more expensive. Each season carried the unspoken requirement to top the last. Danielle felt the strain from her position at the center of operations. She fielded calls from producers, vendors, fans, and the crew. She heard complaints she could not fix and worries she could not share. Her role as the steady one grew heavier as the environment grew louder. As the years passed, the cracks became harder to ignore. Frank's health issues were not sudden, but they became more intrusive. Pain that once could be brushed off began to dictate what he could and could not do. Danielle did not need detailed explanations to understand. She heard it in his breathing, in the pauses between sentences. She watched Mike compensate by pushing harder, trying to maintain momentum, try to keep the machine moving. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply incompatible over time. Danielle's position became increasingly delicate. She was close enough to both men to understand their perspectives, yet far enough removed from the road to feel powerless to intervene. She avoided taking sides, not out of indifference, but out of respect. She knew that forcing conversations before either was ready could do more harm than good. Instead, she focused on what she could control, keeping the shop running, maintaining a sense of normalcy for fans and staff, preserving the image of stability even when it felt fragile. Privately, she mourned the simplicity of the early days, the white van packed with optimism, the excitement of a good find shared over the phone, the laughter that came easily. Fame had amplified everything, including the cost. Danielle understood that success rarely arrives without sacrifice, but watching that sacrifice play out in real time was painful. She saw Frank struggle not just with physical limitations, but with the feeling of falling behind in a world that no longer slowed down for him. She saw Mike carry the weight of leadership, aware that stopping meant risking everything they had built. This history matters because it explains the silence that followed. When Frank began to disappear from episodes, Danielle already carried years of context. She knew the story could not be reduced to a headline or a single argument. It was a gradual unraveling shaped by time, pressure, and the body's refusal to cooperate with ambition. Her reluctance to speak was not avoidance. It was the result of understanding how fragile the truth was and how easily it could be twisted once released. By the time the public noticed something was wrong, Danielle had been living with that knowledge for years. She had watched the transformation from hopeful beginnings to high-stakes reality television. She had seen how the same success that brought opportunity also created distance. And she knew that whatever came next would not be easy to explain because it was not driven by malice, but by limits that no amount of loyalty could overcome. By the time the situation reached a breaking point, it no longer felt sudden to those closest to it. What unfolded in the late 2010s was not a single explosive incident, but a slow collision between physical reality and an unforgiving production schedule. The public saw smiling faces and successful episodes, but behind the scenes, the cost of keeping everything moving had become impossible to ignore. For Frank Fritz, the strain was no longer something he could quietly endure. His health was deteriorating in ways that could not be hidden with humor or grit, and each new shoot demanded more than his body was able to give. Those around him began to notice the pattern. Missed days on set, shortened appearances, long stretches where he was present in name but absent in energy. His struggle with Crohn's disease was no longer manageable through routine adjustments. Pain dictated his movements. Fatigue shaped his mood. Danielle Colby heard it in his voice during phone calls that grew increasingly brief. Conversations that once wandered through stories and jokes now ended abruptly, as if simply speaking required too much effort. She understood without pressing him that something fundamental had changed. At the same time, the pressure on the production intensified. American Pickers was no longer a modest show built on curiosity and charm. It had become a high-stakes operation with large crews, fixed schedules, and significant financial commitments. Delays rippled outward, affecting dozens of people at once. Mike Wolfe felt that weight acutely. He was not just a host anymore. He was the anchor holding everything together. Every decision carried consequences, and every slowdown threatened the momentum that kept the show alive. Mike tried to adapt. Shoots were adjusted. Timelines were shifted where possible. But there were limits to how much flexibility the system allowed. The show demanded consistency, and Frank's condition did not offer it. The gap between what was required and what Frank could realistically provide widened until it became impossible to bridge. Danielle watched this tension build from a distance that felt both close and helpless. She knew neither man was wrong. One was trying to survive physically. The other was trying to keep years of work from unraveling. By 2019, the situation had reached a fragile stalemate. Frank's hospital visits became more frequent. Recovery periods stretched longer. Each return to filming seemed more taxing than the last. Danielle sensed the emotional toll alongside the physical one. Frank sounded defeated in a way she had never heard before. Not angry, not dramatic, just worn down. He had given years of his life to the road, and now his body was refusing to cooperate. The frustration was quiet but deep, the kind that settles in when effort no longer guarantees results. When March 2020 arrived, The final separation came without ceremony. Frank's last episode aired, and then he was gone. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. Danielle learned of it through Mike, whose voice carried exhaustion rather than relief. He did not frame it as a victory or a decision made lightly. It was presented as something that had simply reached its end. Frank was not coming back. The words hung heavy, even without detail. Soon after, Frank spoke publicly in fragments, expressing feelings of being left behind, of calls not returned, of a friendship that seemed to have slipped away. Those comments fueled the fire. Fans latched onto them as proof of betrayal. Danielle struggled with that narrative. She had seen Mike rearrange shoots. She had heard him worry. She knew the story was more complicated than abandonment. At the same time, she understood Frank's pain. Being forced out by her own body can feel indistinguishable from being pushed aside. Danielle did not reach out to correct him. She believed that some wounds were not hers to reopen. Silence felt safer than adding another layer to an already painful situation. She focused instead on keeping her own world steady. The shop remained open. Fans continued to arrive, asking the same questions over and over. Where is Frank? Is he coming back? She answered carefully, choosing words that avoided lies without inviting speculation. It was an exhausting balance. As months passed, more details filtered through quietly. Frank's health struggles were severe. Hospitalizations piled up. Rehabilitation entered the picture. Danielle heard these things not as gossip, but as concern passed along by people who cared. She did not see him as someone who had failed or given up. She saw someone whose circumstances had closed in around him. Pain, isolation, and the loss of purpose can change anyone, and she recognized how easily that could spiral. Meanwhile, the show continued. New episodes aired. New faces appeared. The machine did not stop. Danielle watched from her familiar place, feeling the strange dissonance of success built on loss. The energy was different. Something essential was missing. She missed Frank's understated excitement, his focus on the smallest details, the way he grounded the larger vision. Even when he had been difficult, even when he had pulled away, his presence mattered. The weight of unresolved questions followed Danielle everywhere. Online, people demanded answers. They wanted villains and heroes. They wanted a simple story. What they did not see was the emotional cost of telling a truth that would not satisfy those expectations. Explaining illness is rarely compelling enough for an audience conditioned to drama. Admitting that there was no explosive argument, only a slow erosion, felt inadequate to people hungry for scandal. That tension built until Danielle could no longer ignore it. Watching the narrative spin further from reality became its own burden. When she finally spoke, years after the separation had begun, it was not to defend herself or to attack Frank. It was to correct the frame entirely. She did not deny the pain. She acknowledged it, but she shifted the focus from conflict to consequence, from betrayal to breakdown. She described watching someone she cared about struggle for years, unable to stop the decline, unable to fix what was happening. In doing so, she reframed the entire story. The tragedy was not that Frank left the show. The tragedy was that his body forced him to, that the work he loved became something he could no longer physically sustain, that friendships strained under pressures none of them had anticipated at the beginning. Danielle did not offer closure with neat edges. She offered honesty, the kind that leaves room for grief rather than blame. This chapter of the story sits at the heart of everything that followed. It explains the silence, the hesitation, the careful wording. It shows how a beloved partnership unraveled not through anger, but through limits. And it marks the moment when what had once been a shared adventure turned into separate paths, each shaped by forces beyond anyone's control. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, spreading outward in ways that were harder to measure but impossible to ignore. When Frank Fritz was no longer part of the show, the most visible consequence was his absence on screen, but the deeper impact settled into the lives of those who remained. Danielle Colby felt it every day, not in dramatic confrontations, but in subtle shifts that changed the emotional climate around her. The shop still opened its doors. Fans still lined up. The cameras still rolled. Yet the sense of ease that once held everything together was gone. For Danielle, the emotional toll was layered. She carried guilt for staying silent, frustration at being misunderstood, and sadness for watching something meaningful unravel. People assumed she had chosen comfort over loyalty, that by standing with the show, she had turned her back on Frank. In reality, she was absorbing the weight of both sides. She understood Mike's burden of keeping a massive production afloat, and she understood Frank's pain at being left behind by a life he helped build. Holding those truths at once was exhausting, especially when the outside world demanded a simpler explanation. The shop became a focal point for that tension. Visitors no longer came only to see antiques. They came with questions, with opinions, with judgments already formed. Danielle learned to read the room quickly, sensing when curiosity was harmless and when it carried accusation. She answered politely, often briefly, aware that every word could be pulled apart and reshaped online. Over time, those interactions chipped away at her patience. She missed the days when conversations revolved around objects and stories, not absence and blame. Mike experienced the fallout differently. On the surface, he appeared to move forward, continuing the show, expanding projects, maintaining momentum. But the pressure he carried intensified. Without Frank, the dynamic that had defined the program shifted. He became more exposed, more scrutinized. Criticism followed him relentlessly, accusing him of ambition at the expense of friendship. Danielle saw the fatigue in him when he visited, the forced optimism layered over real strain. Success no longer felt clean. It came wrapped in controversy and loss. Frank's consequences were the heaviest, though largely unseen. Removed from the routine that had defined his identity for years, he faced a void that pain and illness only deepened. Without the structure of filming and travel, days blurred together. Danielle heard through others about hospital visits, setbacks, and the quiet isolation that followed. She did not reach out directly, not out of cruelty, but because she sensed that her presence might complicate rather than comfort. She hoped distance might give him space to heal, even as she worried that space could turn into loneliness. Public reaction magnified everything. Online discussions hardened into camps. One side defended Mike, arguing that a show of that scale could not pause indefinitely. The other side rallied around Frank, portraying him as discarded once he became inconvenient. Danielle watched as nuance disappeared. The reality that illness does not follow production schedules, that compassion does not always look like accommodation, was lost in the noise. Each post, each comment reduced a complex situation to a verdict. The emotional cost of this simplification was significant. Danielle felt her own identity flatten under it. She was no longer seen as the connector or the steady presence, but as a symbol of allegiance. That misrepresentation hurt deeply because it erased years of loyalty and care that did not fit into a binary narrative. She began to retreat emotionally, limiting what she shared, narrowing her public presence to protect herself from further distortion. The atmosphere within the show shifted as well. Without Frank's grounding presence, the energy changed. The discoveries continued, but something subtle was missing. Danielle sensed it when she watched episodes back. The way conversations moved faster, the way certain pauses no longer existed. It was not worse, but it was different, and difference carries its own form of grief. Success felt heavier without the balance that once made it feel shared. As time passed, the consequences extended beyond professional life. Danielle's trust in public perception weakened. She became more guarded, more selective about vulnerability. The experience taught her how quickly good intentions could be rewritten as betrayal. It also forced her to confront the limits of her influence. No matter how much she cared, she could not heal Frank's body, slow the industry, or rewrite the story others chose to believe. Yet within that heaviness, there was also a quiet resilience. Danielle continued to build a life beyond the show, leaning into passions that grounded her. She focused on the tangible, on movement, on creativity that did not require explanation or defense. Those choices were not escapes, but acts of preservation. They allowed her to carry grief without being consumed by it. The long-term impact of Frank's departure was not just a missing face on television. It was a reminder of how fragile success can be when it collides with human limits. It reshaped relationships, altered trajectories, and left scars that could not be edited out. For Danielle, the aftermath was a lesson in endurance. She learned that standing still could be as painful as moving on, and that sometimes the hardest role is not choosing sides, but living with unresolved loss. This period marked a turning point. The story was no longer about why Frank left, but about how everyone carried what followed. The consequences lingered quietly, shaping decisions, emotions, and the way the past was remembered. And beneath it all remained a shared understanding that no version of success could undo what had been lost. There were stories that never made it into interviews or public statements, moments that stayed tucked away because they were too personal, too unresolved to be shared openly. Danielle Colby carried many of those quietly. They lived in passing memories, in brief exchanges that meant little to anyone else but lingered with her long after. These were not dramatic revelations or shocking secrets. They were small, human fragments that revealed how deeply the situation affected everyone involved. She remembered the late nights at the shop when the lights were low and the noise of the day finally settled. In those hours, the absence felt louder. There were habits that no longer made sense, routines built around people who were no longer there. Sometimes she would catch herself preparing for a phone call that never came, instinctively expecting Frank's familiar voice checking in from the road. The realization that it would not happen anymore carried a dull ache she rarely acknowledged out loud. From time to time, people close to Frank would mention how much he missed the work, even when his body could not handle it. He spoke less about the show itself and more about the feeling of usefulness it gave him. The sense of purpose that came from waking up with a destination, a plan, a reason to endure discomfort. Without that, days felt shapeless. Danielle understood that loss intimately. Work had always been more than a job for them. It was identity, community, and meaning rolled into one. There were also moments when Danielle questioned her own distance. She wondered if reaching out sooner might have helped, if a different choice could have softened the loneliness she sensed around Frank. But she also knew that good intentions do not always translate into good outcomes. She had seen how fragile he had become, how easily overwhelmed by attention, even when it came from care. Sometimes the kindest act is restraint, allowing space rather than forcing connection. Friends and crew members occasionally shared quiet updates, never framed as gossip, always tinged with concern. Frank was trying. Frank was struggling. Frank was tired. Those words stayed with her. They painted a picture far removed from the caricature online debates had created. He was not a villain or a victim. He was someone caught between love for what he did and the reality that his body no longer allowed it. Danielle held onto that truth, even when it conflicted with the narratives circulating publicly. There were memories, too, of Mike that rarely surfaced in the broader conversation. Not the driven figure people saw on screen, but the exhausted friend who carried guilt he rarely voiced. Danielle remembered moments when his confidence cracked, when the weight of responsibility slipped through his words. He spoke about Frank with frustration at times, but never without sadness. The idea that he had wanted this outcome never aligned with what she witnessed privately. In quieter moments, Danielle reflected on how little room there was in public discourse for these kinds of contradictions. People wanted clarity, resolution, someone to blame. What existed instead was a long series of compromises, missed opportunities to talk, and circumstances that closed in gradually. The truth did not arrive in a single conversation. It arrived through exhaustion, through silence, through decisions made under pressure. There were also the unseen efforts Frank made to regain some footing. Attempts at treatment, Moments of hope followed by setbacks. Danielle did not track these closely, respecting his privacy, but she heard enough to know it was not a straight line. Progress came and went. Optimism flickered and dimmed. She admired his persistence, even as she recognized how demoralizing that cycle could be. What stayed with her most were the ordinary memories that predated everything else. Frank laughing over a strange find, genuinely delighted by something most people would overlook. The pride he took in understanding how things worked. Those qualities did not disappear when the camera stopped. They remained part of who he was, even as illness reshaped his daily life. Danielle held onto those images as a counterbalance to the darker chapters that followed. These quiet stories mattered because they humanized a situation that had been flattened into spectacle. They reminded Danielle why she resisted speaking too much, too soon. Exposing these fragments to public judgment felt like a violation, not just of Frank's privacy, but of the complexity they all shared. Pain does not always need an audience. Some of it simply needs to be carried. Over time, these unspoken moments shaped how Danielle understood the entire experience. They taught her that loyalty is not always loud, and care does not always look like proximity. They showed her how easily people can misinterpret distance as indifference. Most of all, they reinforced the idea that some truths are not meant to persuade others, only to be lived with quietly. As the years moved on, these stories settled into her memory, no longer sharp, but still present. They informed the way she spoke when she finally chose to speak, and the way she remained silent when words would not help. They were the undercurrent beneath every public statement, every carefully chosen phrase, and they carried the weight of a shared history that could never be fully explained, only honored in fragments. With time, the sharp edges of the story began to soften, not because the pain disappeared, but because perspective slowly took its place. What remained was a broader understanding of what this journey had cost and what it had created. Danielle Colby came to see the entire arc not as a scandal or a failure, but as a reflection of how ambition, friendship, and human limits collide in ways no one can fully control. The legacy was not clean or triumphant. It was complicated, and that complexity carried its own meaning. At its heart, the story was about devotion. Frank Fritz devoted himself to the road, to the hunt, to the satisfaction of uncovering something overlooked and giving it value again. That devotion brought him recognition, community, and a sense of purpose that defined a significant part of his life. It also demanded more from his body than it could ultimately give. The tragedy was not that he lost fame, but that the thing he loved most slowly became something he could no longer physically sustain. That kind of loss cuts deeper than public disappointment. It reshapes identity. Mike Wolfe's legacy carried a different weight. He was the architect of the vision, the one who believed relentlessly when no one else did. His drive turned a niche passion into a cultural touchstone. But leadership often comes with isolation, and his path showed how responsibility can strain even the strongest bonds. The decision to keep moving forward was not proof of indifference, but evidence of the burden he carried. Holding together a massive production while watching a longtime partner fall behind left marks that success could not erase. For Danielle, the meaning of it all settled somewhere between those two realities. She did not define legacy in ratings or longevity. She saw it in the quieter lessons that lingered after the cameras moved on. She learned that loyalty does not always align with outcomes, and that caring deeply does not guarantee the ability to save someone from their own struggle. Her role, often misunderstood, became a testament to the unseen labor of emotional balance, the kind that rarely receives credit but is essential to keeping any shared endeavor alive. The broader legacy of their story extended beyond the individuals involved. It offered a rare glimpse into the cost of turning real lives into ongoing entertainment. The audience saw adventure and nostalgia, but beneath that was a relentless pace that left little room for fragility. The experience underscored how easily vulnerability is edited out and how little space exists for illness in narratives built on consistency and performance. It challenged the idea that passion alone can overcome physical limits. Danielle reflected often on the contrast between what viewers remembered and what she remembered. Fans recalled favorite episodes, iconic finds, and familiar banter. She remembered phone calls filled with fatigue, silences that spoke louder than arguments, and the slow realization that something precious was slipping away. Neither memory was wrong. They simply existed on different planes. Together, they formed a fuller picture of what had been built and what had been lost. In the end, legacy was not about choosing sides or rewriting history. It was about acknowledging the humanity behind the story. Frank's contribution lived on in every moment where curiosity triumphed over spectacle, where small details mattered more than grand gestures. Mike's imprint remained in the scale and endurance of the show itself, proof of what persistence can achieve. Danielle's legacy rested in her restraint, in the way she resisted turning pain into performance, and in her insistence that truth does not need embellishment to matter. There is also a quieter lesson woven through it all, one that Danielle carried forward into her own life. Success does not pause for grief, and grief does not follow a schedule. Learning to live with that tension required acceptance rather than resolution. She stopped searching for a version of events that would satisfy everyone. Instead, she embraced the imperfect truth, trusting that meaning does not depend on universal agreement. As the years passed, the story transformed from something raw into something reflective. It became a reminder that even the most beloved partnerships are subject to forces beyond intention. Health, time, and pressure reshape everything eventually. What endures is not the absence of conflict, but the sincerity of effort and the willingness to face loss without rewriting it into something easier to digest. This understanding did not bring closure in the traditional sense. It brought something quieter, a sense of respect for what had been shared, and an acceptance of what could not be changed. The legacy, then, was not a single message or moral, but an invitation to look more carefully at the people behind the stories we consume, to recognize that real lives rarely fit the narratives we want them to tell. When the story finally reached its quiet end, there was no dramatic curtain call, no definitive moment that wrapped everything in certainty. What remained was a lingering sense of reflection, the kind that settles after the noise fades and only the meaning is left behind. Danielle Colby understood that this was the only ending the story could have, not one built on confrontation or spectacle, but one shaped by acceptance, memory, and the unresolved nature of real life. Frank Fritz's journey closed without the redemption arc many people expected. There was no triumphant return, no public reconciliation designed to reassure an audience. Instead, there was the reality of a man whose body gave out before his passion did. His absence left a space that could not be filled by new faces or continued success. Even as the show carried on, his influence lingered in the rhythm of the work, in a way small discoveries were still treated with care. His legacy lived quietly, not in headlines, but in the foundation he helped build. For Mike Wolfe, the road did not end, but it changed. Carrying forward meant doing so with the weight of what was lost. The van kept rolling, the cameras kept filming, yet the story behind it all was no longer innocent. Success came with memory attached, with an awareness that progress often demands sacrifices that cannot be undone. Mike's persistence ensured the survival of the vision, but it also became a reminder that leadership can be a lonely place when the people who shared the beginning cannot share the end. Danielle's role in this final chapter was not to deliver answers, but to offer honesty. By speaking when she did and remaining silent when she chose, she shaped the tone of the closure. She refused to turn grief into drama or simplify pain for the sake of satisfaction. Instead, she allowed the story to remain human, marked by contradictions and unanswered questions. In doing so, she gave fans something more lasting than a neat conclusion. She gave them a chance to reflect. The ending was not about proving who was right or wrong. It was about recognizing how fragile even the strongest bonds can be under the weight of time, health, and expectation. It asked viewers to reconsider the narratives they consume, to question the instinct to demand villains when reality offers only struggle. Danielle hoped that by sharing the truth as she knew it, people might pause before turning someone's hardship into entertainment. As the noise surrounding the situation gradually faded, what endured was a deeper appreciation for the journey itself. American Pickers was never just about objects. It was about connection, history, and the people who carried those values forward. Frank, Mike, and Danielle each embodied a different part of that spirit. Together, they created something that resonated far beyond what any of them could have predicted. Even fractured, that creation remained meaningful. In the end, closure did not arrive as a statement or a final interview. It arrived in understanding, in the acceptance that not all stories resolve cleanly, and that some losses are permanent. Danielle walked away from the public conversation knowing she had said what needed to be said and left unsaid what did not belong to the spotlight. That balance became her final contribution to a story she had lived for years. Now, the question rests with those who watch from the outside. How should these stories be remembered? As cautionary tales about fame and pressure, or as reminders of the humanity behind the screen? Danielle's hope was simple: that people would carry empathy forward, recognizing that behind every episode and every rumor are real lives shaped by forces far more complex than entertainment allows. The story may be finished, but its meaning continues to unfold in the minds of those who followed it. Perhaps that is the truest ending of all. Not a final word, but an open space for reflection, where viewers are invited to sit with what they have heard and decide what it means to them.